Shame. It's that uncomfortable feeling of knowing you're responsible for some action that will cause pain or bring judgment upon you. Our unwillingness to face shame and experience that discomfort is why so many people attempt to justify actions, make excuses, shift blame, and even tell bald-faced lies. Maybe if people had taken the courageous step to bear their shameful decisions and accept the consequences and discomfort of those admissions, the outcome could have been different for the borough of Centralia, Pennsylvania. If it's true that the city council holds responsibility for the fire because of the controlled burn at the dump, is it shame that prevented those responsible for starting the fire in the first place from looking the fire in the face and making the forceful decisions and pushing for the help they needed to stop it? It seems like a strong possibility. Instead, they falsified the date the fire started, they claimed no jurisdiction and therefore no responsibility, and they fell silent, hoping to be overlooked by a citizenry that would take decades to wake up and see the horrifying results of their leaders' actions and then inaction. Was sparing oneself from the shame of admitting to lighting an illegal dump fire worth the cost of over 1,000 people being displaced from their homes? A citizenry so divided that death threats and even an attempted firebombing resulted? And for one elderly couple, the demise of Centralia precipitated the ultimate tragedy, resulting in a horrific murder-suicide allegedly over the stress of losing their home. What happened in Centralia, Pennsylvania should stand as a stark warning that maybe we need to embrace our shame, take our lumps, and work for solutions. Because it is my humble opinion that the fire that burned away the foundation of a town and endangered its residents is a really good metaphor for the shame that probably burned in the minds and hearts of the members of Centralia's city council way back in 1962, when they realized their alleged controlled dump fire started a chain reaction they never intended. This is the heartbreaking conclusion of our coverage of the mine fire that destroyed an entire community in Centralia, Pennsylvania, on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer and former firefighter.
And I'm Max Rokotansky, road-weary survivor navigating the wasteland of the podcast world. I'm just trying to make sense of it all while avoiding the marauders of mediocre content.
Okay. Before we get started, this past Friday was Valentine's Day, and I am honored to have been part of the Or No Podcasters Give Back series on the You Should Be Here podcast. On Valentine's Day, 17 brand new true crime episodes, all donated by some of your favorite true crime podcasters, dropped for the Or No series. I contributed 2 episodes to the series, and I hope you'll go and listen to the entire series, which is a project to bring awareness to and stand up against the real and prevalent problems of domestic violence. Each download will generate revenues that will go directly to a charity standing up against domestic violence and human trafficking, and it's all completely free to you. Just go and listen, and if you feel compelled to make an additional donation, you can find the link in the show notes. But just listening, downloading, and leaving comments and ratings and reviews helps the series to get seen and raise even more funds for this very important cause. Everyone deserves a safe love. You can find the entire series right now by searching for You Should Be Here on your favorite podcast platform. Other podcast contributors to the series are True Crime Cast, A Million Other Choices, Like Mother Like Murder, Crime with Holly, Least of These, Case Uncovered, True Crime and Headlines, Tragedy with a View, Truly Twisted, and of course yours truly, Crime to Burn. So it's a really amazing lineup of very compassionate podcasters, so go check it out, and I will add the link in today's show notes. And as always, you can support this show just by telling your friends, following us on Instagram, TikTok, X, and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us comments, likes, and share our content when you see it. We're still a little baby podcast, but we're working hard to get to that tipping point where our ad revenue can offset at least our monthly operating costs. We are a long way from there, but we are not asking for your financial support. We are simply asking you to help us get seen so we can find our audience. Leaving those 5-star ratings and reviews, and if you listen on Spotify or Podbean, you can leave comments on the individual episodes. Those are so helpful. And if you wish, you may plaster our logo upon your body or your coffee mugs or water bottles or anything you can slap a sticker upon by heading to our spread shop, which I've linked in the show notes. You can get shirts, hats, stickers, and all kinds of stuff, and I've knocked our profits down to just a few dollars to help you afford anything that you may want. We would love to clad your body in our merch. Wearing one of our shirts with our logo on it probably would feel like getting a warm hug from us all day long. You're welcome to send us feedback, case suggestions, and your own fire stories to crimetoburn@gmail.com. All emails come directly to me. You don't have to go through some admin or AI filter. I will see it.
If you don't want a warm hug, we also have hats.
We have water bottles, if you just want to keep a safe distance. Okay, this is the finale of our Centralia coverage. I think it's pretty obvious from our previous episodes, where we covered all of the theories of how the fire started, that I believe the most likely theory of the fire is the controlled burn in the dump, which puts the responsibility for starting the fire squarely on the Centralia City Council. I believe this is most likely based on the receipts unearthed by a very thorough author named David DeCock, showing that firefighters were paid for standby on the day in question, and interviews with firefighters that recall being on standby for said dump fire. However, there are other theories, and I've discussed them, and I leave it up to you to decide which you believe, but I am continuing our finale with the assertion that the controlled dump fire started the mine fire. But we all know that it's only alleged, and no one's ever been held accountable for this. It's never been counted as a criminal act, even though having a controlled burn at the time was against Pennsylvania law. Then we went through all of the missed opportunities, missteps, and bad decisions that kept the attempts made by DMMI to control the fire from being successful. We finally got some federal funding, and what happened next was basically just a bureaucratic nightmare. Outlining every step in the remaining efforts to bring attention to and get help in dealing with the mine fire would honestly make this episode pretty dull. It's just a lot of political posturing, people avoiding decisions out of fear for their political careers, quote, inadvertent, unquote, leaks of memos. It's all a very complicated spiderweb, and there is a lot of nuance to it. Lots of efforts by the federal government to make the state take responsibility, and lots of state efforts to make the federal government take responsibility, and lots of citizens of Centralia that were now openly critical of all levels of government, from the city council up to the federal level. These citizens were writing letters, circulating petitions, and spreading conspiracy theories. Now, I encourage you to read Fire Underground, The Ongoing Tragedy of the Centralia Mine Fire by David DeCock if you want to understand the complete depths of how politics really played out in Centralia. But to keep this podcast from becoming monotonous, let's sum it up by saying everyone demanded answers, but they had different ideas of what the answers should be. They demanded political support. Politicians lied to them. They made promises they couldn't or didn't keep. And that cycle happened over and over and rinse and repeat for years on end.
No. I bet it's not still going on now, though.
By the time the disaster in Centralia was big enough news that it was garnering primetime news specials and being featured on Good Morning America, there were excuses and explanations and blame shifting and political tangos while everyone tried to point the finger at somebody else to take responsibility financially. And that's what it came down to: whose pot of money would be used to help the residents of Centralia. But here are the important parts. Like I said in the opening, I think the biggest failure of all was the fact that because the fire initially started in mine property not within the town limits, and because mine fires are slow moving generally, everyone adopted an attitude of ignore it and maybe it will go away, and they adopted that attitude for way too long. As soon as they realized there was a fire and they knew Centralia could be in its path one day, the city council should have taken their criticisms for whatever decisions they had already made and figured out just how big of a problem this really was and what possible impact it could have to their town. They missed all the early opportunities to put pressure on DMMI to address the fire in cost-effective and rational ways. They missed opportunities to call out DMMI when their inspectors and contractors made crap decisions that resulted in project failures. They missed all those opportunities to ring the alarm early on in the fire as to how it was being so incredibly mismanaged. But despite all these failures, they rarely, if ever, mentioned the fire in city council meetings for years, because to do so might invite questions about who was responsible, and no one wanted a finger pointing in their direction, or at least that's my theory. You are free to develop your own. But by this point, it's a lost cause. We have carbon monoxide at potentially lethal levels seeping into homes. We have rising temperatures in the basement of some homes and boreholes within a stone's throw of occupied homes that are showing excessive temperatures, illustrating that the town is perched on the edge of an underground hell complete with fire and brimstone. We have carbon dioxide making oxygen levels too low in the basements of some homes to even allow them to light their furnaces. We have methane now leaking into homes and elementary schools at low levels. And at this point, which was nearly 20 years after the fire started, the residents seem to finally wake up to the fact that they're in real trouble. What woke them up to that reality was the health issues that became almost commonplace throughout town: headaches, nausea, extreme fatigue, and especially kids with frequent breathing issues from respiratory infections and asthma. Even some of the town's children began requiring oxygen at night because their breathing would become so labored. This is what seems to have finally shown residents that there is danger in their town. And the fact that it wasn't danger they fully understood was even more terrifying. Parents began demanding to know what the short and long-term effects of low levels of carbon monoxide and other toxic fire gas exposures were. And because politicians were all trying to play the not my problem game, they couldn't get any straight answers to those questions. The health department flatly refused to provide this information, and DeCock actually documents in his book cases throughout these battles where the health department officials outright lied to the residents of Centralia and to the press about the dangers of mine fire gases that were leaking into their homes. Even after they had data showing that low-level exposures could have long-term damaging health effects, they continued to tell people that they were safe in their homes, the homes that had carbon monoxide detectors going off regularly, sometimes multiple times in a day.
The ones they had to share?
Yeah. Recall at the Lamb and Coddington home, the basements were getting hot, the gas levels were getting dangerous, and at this point the federal government and state government were playing chicken, hoping the other would get pressured into acting first so the other one wouldn't have to spend their money on a rectification project. But finally, after having to buy out a few houses that sat in the highest danger as temperatures below the houses just made it impossible to ignore the fact that the fire had definitely breached the town, the rest of Centralia finally started getting more vocal about their expectation that the government was responsible for saving their town, and they were growing frustrated at the lack of action. So the Bureau funded more boreholes. They expected these boreholes would vent fire gases away from the homes.
They're getting frustrated because of the lack of action, so they decided to bore some holes.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So they expected that these boreholes would help vent fire gases away from the homes that had the highest levels of toxic gases in them. And they added more fly ash beneath the Coddingham and Lamb houses. And this had much the same effect as trying to put a band-aid on an arterial bleed. It looked like the government was doing something, but it was far too little of an effort for the growing problems the fire was causing, and it was really nothing more than a PR move to make Centralia residents think something was finally being done, when in fact, the government had no idea what they were going to do. Finally, in the autumn of 1980, the government did produce a report which was made available to all of the residents of Centralia, and in that report they developed a list of 10 different alternatives for how to deal with the fire. 4 of those were immediately dismissed as too unconventional and too high risk for a town already sitting on the precipice of a major mine fire. 1 flushing project was deemed no good because we've already proven that the fire can overcome all of the previous flushing projects. So the other options were different levels of excavation, from a huge trenching project to multiple smaller trenching projects, but the costs would be significant, and not just in terms of financial outlay. The study predicted that anywhere between 109 and 136 Centralia homes would have to be demolished in order to save the rest of the town. And even for those people that wouldn't lose their homes, living in the middle of a huge trenching project wasn't going to be pleasant. Constant blasting and noise and trucks and dust in the air would make Centralia life highly unpleasant for anyone that remained in their homes. But the report also included another option, which was the complete relocation of both Centralia and nearby Burnsville. But the decisions the government promised to make in January never came. And to complicate things, even those families with homes that the health department had deemed unsafe to live in, they were being denied the promised government buyout. Because of government red tape, bureaucratic lawyers claimed that the law was written in a way that did not give them authority to purchase these homes or pay the families relocations the way the law was currently written, and the law would have to be changed first. Then on Valentine's Day 1981, our small friend, 12-year-old Todd Dombowski, was nearly swallowed by the earth, as we discussed in an earlier episode, and nothing puts pressure on the government like bad press. And where the risks were invisible up until now with poison gases seeping into homes, the very real, very dramatic near-death of Dombowski and the government's lack of action was now drawing a lot of the wrong kind of press attention, and finally politicians started seeing their careers potentially also burning away as the fire crept under the town. And in the ensuing few years, while the federal government and state government postured to try to get the other one to act first, the community of Centralia fractured over whether or not they should take government buyouts and leave, or whether they should be pressuring the government to solve the mine fire once and for all and save as much of the town as possible. The residents closest to the fire, they lived in constant fear of gases killing their families and had to constantly worry about the unknown of what longer-term low-level effects of this exposure was doing to their family. They tended to favor a government buyout and relocation because they felt that this was going to be faster. And the residents knew that even if the government came through with some sort of project to fix Centralia, it was probably going to take some of their homes with it anyway. They didn't feel like they had the luxury of waiting for project approval and funding and bidding and getting through that entire maze of government bureaucracy because their families were in immediate danger right now. However, not all of the residents closest to the fire felt this way. Perhaps the most outspoken was a woman named Helen Wormer. Now, she believed that the gases that people were reporting in their homes were not from the fire at all. They were from home appliances, which Helen isn't here anymore to defend herself, but darling, no. Now let's give her some grace. At the time, the government was keeping a tight lid on the gas readings it was taking, but the low oxygen levels alone were proof this wasn't just a hot water heater or regular household activities or even smoking, which we know can cause small amounts of carbon monoxide. But Helen was absolutely convinced that this was just a land grab attempt by the federal government to drive the residents out of Centralia so they could take over the coal rights to the anthracite below the town's property. Well, we now have the gift of hindsight that Helen didn't have, and now that we're 62 years into the fire and the owners of the land have still not gone back in to get that coal, and the anthracite market hasn't rebounded since it began declining back in the 50s, we can officially probably put a pin in Helen's accusations of a conspiracy. But she hung on to them until her death. But the residents of Centralia, further from the fire that didn't have to deal with the constant fear of mine fire gases seeping into their homes, they wanted to save as much of the town as possible. They wanted the government to put the fire out once and for all, and the only surefire method to extinguish a fire in the anthracite region was to dig it out. Flush barriers failed, and the steep slopes prevented the flushing material from properly building up and crafting effective barriers. Fly ash barriers would eventually settle, leaving openings at the top through which mine fires could vault. At one point in 1981, a non-binding vote was taken, and the residents appeared to support a relocation of the town by a vote of 2-1. But many residents appeared to believe that it was still possible to relocate the people that wanted to relocate and to put the fire out, and leave the coal rights to Centralia and not allow them to be taken by the government. However, very loud and very vocal residents were screaming that this was nothing more than a grab to get these coal rights, and the tensions between these opposing factions in the town grew so dramatic that members of a citizens group began receiving death threats, and one member even had his motorcycle shop firebombed with a Molotov cocktail.
From whom were they receiving death threats?
From people that were opposing the position that this citizens group was taking.
It was like a little town civil war or something.
Yeah, and honestly, firebombing by a Molotov cocktail is kind of a strange choice for a town that's already being threatened by fire.
Well, you got lots of fire around. You could just put it in a bottle and throw it.
Well, luckily, he was able to escape. Meanwhile, press from across the world were following the Centralia disaster, and politicians were in the hot seat with pressure to act. Residents of Centralia even began traveling to Capitol Hill to tell their stories to the House Mines and Energy Management Committee, as well as any congresspeople that would listen. And then the fire nearly claimed another life. On March 19th, 1981, John Cottingham, the guy that had to close down his gas station because of the fire, he had to be rushed to the hospital because he fell unconscious due to carbon monoxide, and by some miracle, he happened to fall out of his bed when he fell unconscious, and his body falling to the floor woke up his wife, who was downstairs, and she went to go check on him, and had that not happened, he may have actually died. So this just ignited tempers and seemed like it might be enough to get attention in Washington. Might be enough to get those heavy bureaucratic wheels to start turning. But less than 2 weeks later, John Hinckley shot President Reagan outside the Washington Hilton, and Capitol Hill became understandably distracted as Centralia once again was screaming for attention but was being overcrowded by bigger and flashier headlines.
That was really unfortunate in my eyes during the time because it put a hiccup in my favorite television show, which was, at the time, The Greatest American Hero. The main actor's name was John Hinckley. Different.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it put like a speed bump in that show for a while. Never really actually recovered, I don't think.
Huh, I had no idea. Then on April 20th, 2 businessmen appeared at the city council meeting and claimed to represent a corporation that wanted to purchase the town of Centralia for $30 million because they wanted the coal underneath it. They offered to pay each resident double their property value. However, they refused to disclose the name of the company they were representing, claiming that to do so would make the company some kind of business target of its competitors. And this seemed so outrageous that residents refused to consider the offer, and the men disappeared, never to be heard from again.
That did sound shady, like one of those cold calls that you get from Calcutta or wherever.
However, the appearance of these mystery men claiming that they wanted this coal fortune below the town only strengthened the arguments of conspiracy theorists that this was all just an elaborate hoax to make a coal grab. In fact, I wouldn't think it would be hard to believe that the conspiracy theorists might have even considered staging this plot to strengthen their argument. I'm not saying they did that, but I can see how it might be appealing to people that were so passionate and outspoken that the government was about to rob the town blind that they might consider some sort of crazy plot to get more people to believe their position.
Well, it's not inconceivable that people are thinking a little bit sub-rationally. Nothing rational is happening anyway. Where are you going to pull it from? Where
are you going to pull it from? There is no rationality left to be had. The families living within a 16-mile zone were told in 1981 that they would be relocated because their homes had been deemed unsafe. But this hit a huge hiccup at the federal government level. It turns out the law under which they were expecting to buy out these properties specifically stated in terms of the properties that it planned to acquire that it had to calculate a fair market value, and that calculation had to take into consideration adversely affected properties by past coal mining practices. In a town like Centralia, the idea that their homes would be reduced in value because the real estate market in town was so depressed from the fires, there was a real fear that the government appraisers could have valued each home as completely worthless, leaving the Centralia residents high and dry. But original buyout offers did come in, but they included a 20% depreciation for the mine fire, a fire that wasn't the fault of these residents. One family specifically lamented that they had only been offered $11,000 for their home plus $15,000 in relocation expenses. At the time, the average home price in the United States was $83,900, and in Pennsylvania it was $77,400. Others were willing to consider the proposals but wanted the government to give them a clear plan of action for stopping the fire before they would consider any offers to be bought out. Among those residents was Helen Wormer. However, the government had zero intention of fighting the fire once a relocation project was complete. Once they saved the residents from danger, they believed that to spend more money to stop the fire would be a waste of money.
Well, how did the government know that fire wouldn't act like the very last part of a fuse on a cherry bomb and just explode the whole earth?
They probably had scientists telling them that wasn't the case.
Scientists.
Meanwhile, the fly ash barrier that had kept the fire from progressing toward nearby Burnsville completely failed, and the fire took aim at another small Pennsylvania town before it had even finished decimating the community of Centralia. Even as buyout offers were being issued, albeit less than satisfactory ones, the mayor argued that it was foolish to relocate the entire town when only part of the village was in danger. But while residents like Wormer were demanding a plan before anyone accepted what many people considered to be lowball buyouts, it's easy to understand why many of the residents just took the money and left. In one home, They reported that their basement temperature was constantly 90 degrees no matter what they did, and no matter how long they let the water run, the water never cooled off below scalding anymore. To stay meant to risk their families' lives, and the possible threat of another person getting sucked into the earth or never waking up. These were real prevalent concerns in some Centralia residents' lives. And
presented a challenge to the tourism board.
Absolutely. And to those people, taking the buyouts was the obvious choice. But to their friends and neighbors that didn't want to leave town, they thought people taking these buyouts was screwing over any future negotiation power they had to negotiate for the government to put out the fire. And this fractured the town. In a newspaper survey that August, it was clear that the vast majority of townsfolk now believed that the fire was under Centralia. 144 respondents were in favor of relocating, while only 27 were opposed and 5 had no opinion. But 124 people also believed the conspiracy theory, while 40 people said they did not and 12 had no opinion. But to me, the most shocking response was that when asked if the Bureau of Mines and OSM had made the public aware of all the relevant information on the mine fire, only 10 respondents answered in the affirmative, and 164 said no, while 2 had no opinion. That's how little the people of Centralia trusted the government, and who can blame them? And furthermore, only 9 people indicated that the governor of Pennsylvania had done enough to help Centralia, while 166 said he had not, and 1 had no opinion. Add to that distrust Dr. James Fox of the Division of Environmental Health. He was quoted in the newspaper saying, quote, "There's no public health problem in Centralia," end quote. The reporter asked him why he believed this was true, and Fox said, quote, "No Centralia home has ever had a dangerous level of gases," end quote. Every resident in Centralia, except possibly Helen Wormer, a woman living in her own world of made-up science in which cooking Brussels sprouts apparently increased carbon monoxide levels, everyone else knew this wasn't true. And yet there it was, in black and white, encased in quotation marks. Their reality was being outright denied by the officials that were supposed to be protecting them, and were supposed to be coming up with a solution to their problem. So it's easy to see why Centralia residents were getting angrier and angrier. On October 16th, one family was in the process of moving out of their home, and they backed their vehicle over the lawn to make loading easier from the front door. Their car sank a few feet, and when it was towed out, the hole widened. And a few hours later, when the contractor arrived to fill it in, an 8-foot deep by 10-foot by 10-foot square of earth had opened up in the ground. The conditions in Centralia were absolutely becoming more dangerous. Now, aerial photos around this time show swaths of land with bands of dead trees and vegetation, all killed either by the heat of the fire below or by the toxic gases that were venting through the earth, or both. Steam and fog were common sights coming out of fissures in the earth, and at times they combined and made roads in the area completely impassable due to zero visibility. Multiple times the police were forced to close roads, including the Route 61, the main road into the town. Now at this point, only the families that lived in a 16-acre boundary had been offered buyouts, but a growing fear in the town spurred them into action, and they sent a contingent to Washington to lobby for help. The problem was that the town was still divided on what the approach should be. Many believed large parts of the town were safe from the fire and its toxic effects. Those that held a different opinion felt their welfare was in jeopardy and wanted the buyout option extended immediately. In perhaps a misguided attempt to please everyone, there was still a push for the government to offer buyouts to those who wanted it, but still also come up with a plan to stop the fire. But the government was not going to do both. The costs were just too high to save Centralia at this point. But they did that borehole project we talked about. It had been held up for years while everyone argued about what to do, but now they went ahead with it. They wanted to know exactly where the fire was. Now, the Centralia coal veins are like inverted bowls stacked within each other. So a smaller bowl on the bottom, a larger inverted bowl over it, and succeedingly larger bowls. And one of the reasons that Centralia residents believed the fire would never affect them is because the specific vein the fire was believed to be inside would eventually hit the mine water pool. And everyone thought this would be the fire break that would stop the fire. And then in December of that year, Centralia went completely dark. A tree had been burned up from the root system near Route 61, and the wind had toppled it over and it took out a power line. This proved beyond any doubt that the fire was spreading not just to Centralia but also toward Burnsville. Then in 1982, a leaked memo came to light. This memo was anonymously mailed to the newspaper, in which the federal government had threatened Pennsylvania, saying that they would cut off all of the funds that were supporting the home gas monitoring equipment unless the state accepted a proposed $850,000 from OSM to do the exploratory drilling and borehole project. But after they did that, the state had to accept responsibility to pay any further attempts to attack the fire. It was outright blackmail, and it proved that the federal government had zero intention of spending any of its money to fight the fire. They were not planning to stop the progression of the Centralia fire. They were ready to sacrifice the entire town to the inferno resulting from their, and by their I mean state, local, and federal government, folly.
Let that be a lesson to the rest of the world, though. We'll let our own towns burn because we want to save $1.
Meanwhile, our friend Helen Wormer was busy trying to convince her neighbors that the fire was already past the boundaries of Centralia and everyone was safe now. If deluded hope could have saved that town, Helen would have saved that town all by herself. Meanwhile, a forest fire broke out, and large chunks of the nearby cliffside began falling to the ground below, revealing flaming rocks. The land around town was practically screaming at the people the danger that they were facing. But the borehole project began, and the intention was to find the exact extent of the fire. Now, they were looking not just for temperatures. They were looking at what gases were being forced out, which could tell them if it was a smoldering or flaming fire in that location. They could also tell from whether the air was being expelled from the hole, if the fire was right there pushing the air out, or if the air was being sucked into the hole, then they knew the fire was further away and it was using that borehole to suck oxygen in. Now, at one point, it was suggested that they could close off the drainage tunnel and it might have an effect on the fire. And the reason they thought that was because when they measured the air movement in the drainage tunnel, it measured at 44,000 cubic feet per minute into the mines, meaning it was feeding the fire 44,000 cubic feet per minute of fresh air. That's a huge airflow.
I don't think I could breathe that much air.
Now, the problem was that if they closed off this drainage tunnel, they were opening up an entirely new spate of problems, including flooding problems, and there was no proof that this could stop the fire. The fire was likely just to find new cracks and fissures and crevices to feed itself, and it may not actually burn out as was proposed. Meanwhile, tempers in town flared hot as the members of a group called Concerned Citizens began receiving calls advising them that the actions their groups were promoting or considering would earn its members a lifetime home in Centralia, in the cemetery. Threatening calls were occurring at all hours of the day and night. The opposition to this group claimed that talk of relocation of the town was premature and destructive. However, recall that by a nearly 2-to-1 vote, the town had already shown their support for relocation, so this was an instance of extremists exerting the will of the few over the majority through bullying and intimidation.
And it just speaks to the state of modern human existence. Back when we were hunter-gatherer wanderers, a mine fire, well, let's go somewhere else.
And then the crews found a borehole with temperatures exceeding 500 degrees right near the Russian Orthodox Church. Temperatures had increased at this borehole over 300 degrees, indicating that the fire threat to Centralia had not passed by despite Helen Wormer's intense and outspoken delusions. Anyone that had delusions at this point that the fly ash barrier was protecting any part of town were now absolved of that delusion, except for Helen. This specific borehole had actually been installed as the early warning borehole to monitor the integrity of that barrier. So Centralia was completely unprotected. And about this time, David Lamb's motorcycle shop was firebombed with a Molotov cocktail while he and his son were asleep upstairs. He was able to put the fire out with an extinguisher before the fire spread beyond the shop, but only because a passing motorist had seen the flames and stopped and banged on his door to wake him up. Lamb and his son might have become fatalities not of the fire itself, but of the devolving community relationships in Centralia. By December 1982, a new problem emerged. Route 61 and the Penfield's natural gas pipeline that ran parallel to it were in grave danger of the fire. The fire was moving several feet per day toward the highway, and there was considerable concern. You see, less than 6 feet of cover existed along the highway, and below that 6 feet was an 11-foot deep mine chamber. And as the roof of that chamber expanded as the fire spread through it, it could become unstable and collapse, dropping the highway and anyone unlucky enough to be on it into the mine chamber below. If the impact or the fire didn't kill them, the poisonous gases would surely get them even before a rescue crew could ever get to them.
I would die from sheer horror.
By January 5th, 1983, boreholes in the area showed temperatures near the highway of over 700 degrees, and then a crack opened in the highway, and when it rained, the steam created a pea soup fog through which no driver could ever see, and Route 61 had to be closed.
Well, at least it tasted good.
I don't like pea soup.
Why not? It's pretty good.
Maybe I haven't ever had your pea soup. Then on July 12, 1983, in a conference room at the Department of the Interior, a report was circulated that would essentially be the death certificate of Centralia. Recall that Centralia residents believed the mine pool fire would eventually stop the fire's progress, sparing at least half of the town. This belief depended on the fact that the fire was confined to the Buck vein. Recall that the veins of coal here were like a stack of inverted bowls. However, this report from the drilling showed that the fire was in the Skidmore, 7-foot, and Buck leader veins, which would usher it right into the Mammoth, 4-foot, Holmes, and Primrose veins, which would allow the fire to vault right over the mine pool. The report predicted that the fire, which was currently 195 acres, would grow to over 3,700 acres and take out not just the town of Centralia, but also Burnsville and a small hamlet nearby called Germantown. An excavation was the best chance to stop the fire.
Hey, I'm sorry. We have hamlets in this country?
And apparently, it only had like 6 houses in it. That's why they called it a hamlet.
What's a full town? A full ham? A ham hock?
Probably.
Like a hamlet sounds like a tiny piece of ham.
It does. An excavation was the best chance to stop the fire, but it would need to be 3,700 feet long, 450 feet deep. That's the height of a 5-story building. And it would snake right through the center of Centralia. The community could not be saved. In addition, if they did undertake this project, it would cost a whopping $660 million. All the other options presented in the report could not be guaranteed to stop the fire completely, and they were done taking bets. They'd already lost so many in Centralia. Everyone, including Helen Wormer, was shocked. But Helen wasn't one to go home and work on accepting things as they were. Instead, she circulated a petition asking the government to do nothing and leave Centralia intact. The fact that she collected 412 signatures just proves to me that the residents of Centralia, exposed to toxic gases from fires in their homes and issuing from boreholes around town, coupled with the extreme stress and mentally toxic environment of a town divided, they were bordering on incapable of logical thought any longer. And honestly, they have my compassion, because there comes a time in any highly emotional fight where you just decide you want to be left alone. And these people had been lied to so many times by the government at so many levels that their trust was obliterated. So anyone pointing fingers at Helen should probably shift their perspective and point fingers where the pointy fingers should belong, pointing at the state, local, and federal government. The government lied to the people that they were supposed to be protecting. They gave false information. They hid information that the people asked for and needed to make decisions for the health and safety of their family. It's not just politics, it's treason. The crime of betraying one's country.
Hey. But at least they only did it that one time.
The government lied to them until they had so little faith in the information that the government provided them that they couldn't and wouldn't make logical decisions. The government did that. The government caused the delusion and distrust that led to a community destroyed, and I haven't even gotten to the most horrific results of the government's lies and half-truths and hiding information.
Hold up. I think it's important to remember that your government is your neighbors. Your government was selected by you, supposedly. And they're not some disembodied entity. They're your friends and family and neighbors, so...
They never behaved like friends and families and neighbors in this town.
Yeah, I know, but it's like when you dress somebody up in a prison guard uniform and give them fake prisoners, even though they're not a real prison guard, they start to act like it's just human behavior.
Their shame needs to be hung around their neck for the world to see. They are the perfect poster children for why we cannot trust our government to protect us or to save us or to even make sound decisions for us. The government in this situation was the picture of how power and money corrupt, and they should be ashamed.
There does need to be more shame at large, I think.
Ultimately, a bill did pass in Congress that specified that residents must be paid fair market value with no penalty deducted for the mine fire. In addition to the buyout, each resident would be eligible for $15,000 in relocation money. But that was for property owners in Centralia. Not all the town's residents were owners. Some of them were tenants. And they were not eligible for buyouts and relocation funds. The houses that they resided in were sold out from under them to the government, and those that couldn't or wouldn't leave were turned into involuntary squatters. By 1986, fewer than 50 homes remained in Centralia. The abandoned homes had been bulldozed as residents left. They often took everything they could from their homes, including the siding, windows, carpets, appliances. They stripped them bare. By May 12, 1987, one couple, Bertha Mayernick and her husband John, were one such set of tenants turned squatters. Now, they had been offered $4,000 in down payment assistance or a rent subsidy for 4 years in order to leave, but they were given a timeline to make the decision. And as they continued to delay and were given extension after extension, the pressure to get out led to a huge argument between the couple on October 6, 1987. The couple apparently could be volatile. They were drinking that night, and at some point John stabbed his wife to death and left her body in the house, drove to the Badlands surrounding Centralia, poured gasoline over himself, and self-immolated, dying a horrific death.
That's a really bad night.
It's just, and you can't say that it was just the situation in Centralia that caused their volatile relationship or how bad that fight got that night, but the stress that they'd been under may have escalated what was already a bad situation.
So I think what you've been saying throughout this series is that things actually got worse for people once the fire started and never got better.
Exactly.
See, I'm paying attention.
By 1990, 63 citizens remained in Centralia. Now, those that did not want to leave sued to stop the eminent domain, and those lawsuits actually continued into the early 2000s. Ultimately, the last of the remaining residents of Centralia were given a large cash settlement, and they were permitted to stay in their homes until their passing, upon which time the land will transfer to the state. Essentially, they were made into permanent squatters on land they no longer had the right to own, but at least they didn't have to pay taxes on it. The town zip code was eliminated, and as of this recording, someone I've been in contact with that lives just outside Centralia tells me that in 2025 there are 5 homes remaining in Centralia. And online sources suggest there are still 5 residents, which matches the last records I have from 2020. But I haven't been able to confirm if that number has changed since 2020.
You think they have an HOA?
No. Now, there is one municipal building in town. It houses the old fire engine, and when it is required, it is staffed from nearby Ashland. And as the buildings have been demolished one by one, the surrounding forest overgrows the foundations that remain of a once thriving community, and Centralia, Pennsylvania goes down in history as a stark illustration of how the government failed a people. And Helen Wormer, she never did move out of Centralia. She passed away in 2001, but she is there still, buried in St. Ignatius Cemetery. Now, whether you agree with me that this fire is the result of an illegal controlled burn or you take a different view, one thing is certain. The government failed every single person in Centralia. First, the town council refused its duty to react and protect its citizens, claiming they had no jurisdiction. Then the state DMMI mismanaged multiple projects funded through the state, and they bet on unproven mine firefighting technologies at the expense of an entire town. The health department withheld information and then outright lied to people. The federal government outright threatened the state government with blackmail to avoid financial responsibility for fighting a fire they had failed to get involved in when they should have because they didn't want to spend their money on it. And when residents turned on each other in fear and frustration, they only compounded the problem because no matter what solutions were approved, the government couldn't appease all of the constituents, so no one wanted to take responsibility for making decisions that might cost their political careers. And that's the story of how the government turned their backs and shirked their responsibility to protect the citizenry from danger, and make no mistake, it wasn't the last time either. Now, treason has several definitions, but one of them from the Oxford Dictionary is the act of betraying someone or something. So this has been the story of how a government got away with treason in Centralia, Pennsylvania, on Crime to Burn. And everyone should be fucking ashamed of how they behaved.
I didn't see the red light.
I'm falling apart more every day.
Boy, oh boy. I think I know what you're talking about.
He only digested parts of it, but he did tear all of it into shreds.
Dog's helping you grow up.
I will never grow up. We've already discussed this. I'm just not grow-upable.
And if we start seeing signs of maturity or growth, then we do something immediately to rectify the situation?
Emergency whoopee cushion.
I remember being a bus full of whoopee cushions. Someone was perpetrating the practical jokes on you?
Yeah.
I thought we were in a different story, so start over.
Not really fights, but disagreements going on. And so I'd be in the middle of trying to make a point and sit down on a whoopee cushion, and it was just pissing me off.
That's hilarious.
It is now, but at the time I was so mad I made a Facebook post about it. And now every Valentine's Day, I get a f***ing reminder about how I flew off the handle about a whoopee cushion.
You're acting like a grown-up.
I'm going to get a whoopee cushion next Valentine's Day, aren't I?
You might get one this afternoon.
Hey, I like your pants.
Trying to talk less about their mothers and...
Oh my God, we are growing up.
Should I talk more junk about mothers on the video games?
When I get stressed out, I turn into a potty mouth. I teach those kids words that haven't even been invented yet.
Those little Rizzlers might skibbity you right to Ohio.
I can use damn English, that's not a word.
And they would probably retort by something here probably f***ed up your imagination. And that's messed up for a little kid to say.
I certainly don't want to Google that. That'll f*** up my algorithm.
There's no way you can possibly further injure your algorithm.
My algorithm's
looks like a serial killer. Crazy.
I mean, every true crime podcaster has an algorithm that would scare a psychiatrist.
I'm not even psychiatrist adjacent.
I'm an engineer. We're not psychiatrists.
Got one finger in it.
Is it shame? Nope. Okay,
it's definitely
fine.
Not shame.
What happened in Centralia? No, that's too happy.
You see what happened? This is great.
Was I too fast getting started again?
I gave you a swallow.
Oh.
What the hell? Well,
He's not a swallower.
I know you're revved up. Oh. It's true.
What am I doing?
What
I will delete
ass are you talking
all
about?
that out.
Anything I say, like, there's a lot of ways to take that.
I don't know what's gotten into me.
I just spaced the whole thing.
It's probably for the best. And in the ensuing... Nope. Ensuing.
Oh, that's more complicated than I was hoping it would be. The beautiful prison hospital. Cut!
My life in 2 pieces. You gonna make me some pea soup, baby?
And then you looked at me like I was...
lunch.
That's not how I would make the pea soup, though. Do you really care what else I do to it?
No, once you had me at butter. I'm about to have a temper tantrum, so hang on.
I'm gonna name my the buck vein. That's hot.
God bless her. She was bat poop crazy.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about a little something we all know and love. Shame. Yes, that warm, sinking feeling in your stomach when you realize you've sent an email to the entire company instead of just your boss. But hold on, before you cringe and run for the hills, let's celebrate the unappreciated value of shame. Shame keeps you from wearing socks with sandals in public. It's the voice that whispers, maybe don't post that third selfie the other day. It's the invisible hand that stops you from bringing up your extremely detailed Star Trek fan theory at a party. You know the one. In fact, without shame, who knows where we'd be? Probably dancing poorly in a public square. Unaware, unbothered. So next time you feel that little twinge of, I shouldn't have said that, don't run from it. Embrace it. It's life's way of saying, hey, maybe try that again, but with less awkwardness. Let shame be your guide to staying humble, human, and slightly less embarrassing. Thank you. And remember, shame, it's what separates us from the overly confident toddlers of the world. Shame. Get some. Kill it.
This Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2025, You Should Be Here, a podcast series by Fire Eyes Media, was released titled Or No. After the well-known concept, Do you love me? Check yes or no. And in this season of You Should Be Here, A group of true crime podcasters team up to share stories and advocate for victims and survivors of domestic abuse and domestic violence. Love shouldn't hurt. Love shouldn't harm you. And with every listen, with every download of Or No, you are helping give back to individuals who have suffered in an unloving and abusive relationship. You are helping raise money in this 100% Podcasters Give Back collaboration to give back to nonprofits which are standing against domestic violence. If you or someone you love is a victim of domestic abuse, we beg of you to call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. The person on the end of the line will be able to provide resources and provide help because we want you safe. We want you unharmed, and we want you to know you deserve a love that is happy and healthy and never harmful, and that you should be here. This collaborative podcast was brought together by Fire Eyes Media, and Jen and Jules both bring episodes in this series as well. But I want to take the time to shout out the others who helped work on Or No and donated their